Hello and welcome to the review of your System Performance Measures draft data. I'm Allison Thiessen, the Director of the CARES Regional HMIS. In this presentation, I will provide an overview of your draft data pulled during the last week of January 2020. We will also briefly review the reporting parameters of each of the 6 measures currently being submitted to HUD. Dates and deadlines. The data collection period for this report is October 1st, 2018 to September 30th, 2019. The last day we can accept comments on the draft data is Friday, February 14th, because we have to submit the report to HUD via HDX by February 28th, and we may need time to explore and correct the data issues. If all goes well, we expect to submit the data on Monday, February 24th. Over the past several years, HUD has shifted focus from looking strictly at project performance to the successes and failures of the entire system. The system performance measures, first reported in 2015, are the initial framework of this more interconnected view of homeless services systems. The LSAs, or Longitudinal Systems Analysis, which replaced the former AHAR, or Annual Homeless Assessment Report, and STELA, the new data dashboards HUD is starting to give us access to, are the next steps. HUD is now looking at much more than project-level annual performance reports and the COC grant application to make individual funding decisions. They're using data from these community-level reports to really gauge the needs of the community and ensure that the grant requests align with the data presented, not to be punitive, but rather to be efficient. Because of this, it is vital that the HMIS data be accurate, reflective, and up-to-date in our reporting. If we do not accurately show the community need and that we are addressing it through data-driven methodologies, we compromise our HUD funding. While all HMIS data is important to the system performance measures, the primary data utilized for this analysis includes intake and discharge dates, prior living situation, and basic demographics. This, along with the point-in-time data, allows the report to calculate homeless status, income change, average and median lengths of stay, and returns to homelessness from previous discharge to permanent destinations. These are the building blocks of the LSAs, which analyze all of the other variables in a much more intensive and dynamic way. It's important to remember that changes from year to year can be attributed to many factors, including data cleanup, funding streams starting or stopping, HMIS coverage changes, and even extreme weather events. None of these numbers can be taken in silo or analyzed without that context. We will now walk through all of the data standards except 6, which is not yet reported on, and your community data quality report. An explanation of each measure will be given, as well as a brief analysis of your data. The purpose of this presentation is to identify anything that looks odd, out of place, or unusual to you as a community member who knows your community services and structure, so that input can be given to the HMIS and planning teams for consideration prior to report submission. In brief, measures 1 and 2 are our benchmark measures. They look at how fast we are moving consumers into housing from homelessness, and then how successful we are at keeping those consumers from returning to the homeless system. The next set of measures, 3 through 7, break down how we achieve measures 1 and 2 by looking at the most significant factors in achieving and maintaining that housing. Finally, the last thing we look at is our most difficult yet important data quality measure for looking at this framework through an analytic lens, the destination at discharge. Measure 1, the length of time homeless. This measures the number of clients active in the report date range across emergency shelter and safe haven in metric 1.1, and then emergency shelter, safe haven, and transitional housing in metric 1.2, along with their average and median length of time homeless. This includes time homeless during the report range as well as prior to the report start date, going back though no farther than October 1st of 2012. What we look for here is that the average number of days makes sense in the context of what we understand about the community. A large difference between the average and median length of stay can also indicate a problem in emergency shelter data collection, as it indicates a very few long-term stayers. The HMIS team has worked to identify these and make sure that the data is accurate, working closely with uploading agencies and emergency shelters who direct enter to get data quality that is truly reflective of the community. A few forgotten discharges or bad upload files can significantly impact the community's data. The other extreme in data, which is what we're seeing here, is that there is a large percentage of low-stay consumers. 202 records show 5 days or less, with 68 of them being only 1 day. While this gives the big spread between average length of stay and median length of stay, it also contributes to this community's shortening of the average length of stay significantly, as only 12 records are over 60 days, and 4 only files contain consumer length of stays over 100 days, the highest being 169 days. The second set of data includes information from each client's living situation data, which is your data standards element 3917, as well as time spent in permanent housing projects between project start and housing move-in. This information is added to the client's entry date, effectively extending the client's entry date backwards in time. This adjusted entry date is then used in the calculations just as if it were the client's actual entry date. The numbers are higher because you're looking at a longer length of time in this measure. A data issue that has been identified is that users are not always updating this when readmitting consumers into shelter projects, which means that we cannot use this measure with as much confidence as we'd like to in our planning. Steps are being taken by the HMIS team to update training and do targeted outreach to end users to help fix this. Measure 2 returns to homelessness. This measures clients who exited street outreach, emergency shelter, transitional housing, safe havens, or permanent housing to a permanent housing destination in the date range 2 years prior to the report date range. Of those clients, the measure reports how many of them returned to homelessness as indicated in the HMIS for up to 2 years after their initial visit. This measures how successful the community's homeless system is at stably housing consumers long term. It does this by tracking individuals from the selected housing types who were discharged to permanent housing destinations for 2 years in chunks of time to see if they returned to homelessness. In your data, we've seen a decrease and increase of 0% in homelessness over the 2 years. The expectation is that the community will use this data to identify risk factors, gaps in services, and the best practices through the data, helping their consumers stay housed longer. There has been some concern that moving to a coordinated entry methodology, in which the most vulnerable and often most difficult to serve are housed first, would create higher recidivism rates. That this has not been the case shows the success of a collaborative, community-wide approach to a consumer care with a housing-first focus. Data quality considerations here revolve primarily around destination at discharge, which is why it's the one data element that's looked at in the report's data quality section. High percentages of inaccurate or incomplete destination at discharge data makes measuring and researching recidivism very difficult. Measure 3 is your changing your point in time count. This measures the change in the PIT counts of sheltered and unsheltered homeless persons as reported on the PIT, not from HMIS. If a COC did not conduct an unsheltered count in a particular fiscal year, then the next most recent unsheltered data are used. No data are entered into this shell. It auto-populates from the most recently entered HIC shells in the HDX. Measure 4, income growth in COC-funded projects. This measure trips people up because it's the only measure limited by funding source. COC-funded projects are required to collect this information while many other project types are not, hence the narrowed scope. Also worth noting is that the System Performance Measures report uses a different calculation of income growth than the APR does, so it's hard to track it backwards to other project and community reporting. This question measures employment, non-employment, and total income growth for stayers and leavers separately. Stayers who have been in the system for more than a year have the growth measured from one year to the next, while leavers are measured from system entry to system exit. In this measure, we look for percentages to go up. In 4.1, 24 of the adults who stayed in projects for increased earned income 17%, which is an increase of 5% from last year. Non-employment cash income in 4.2 showed at 42% of adults increasing their income, which is 14% over last year, and a total increase in 4.3 of cash income for stayers at 18%. 4.4 shows the leavers, and of the 83 adults who left the projects, 14 or 17% left with increased earned income, an increase of 12% over last year. However, non-employment cash income decreased 22%, which means that adult leavers decreased cash income earned and non-earned by 8% over the previous year. It's vital to remember that this allows us to measure consumers as they move through the system, so when users don't update the face sheet annually or intakes at readmission, this information reported may not be reflective of the community. Measure 5, number of persons who became homeless for the first time. This measures the number of people entering the homeless system through emergency shelter, safe haven, or transitional housing in metric 5.1, or emergency shelter, safe haven, transitional housing, or permanent housing in metric 5.2, and determines whether they have any prior enrollments in the HMIS over the past 2 years. So those with no prior enrollments are considered to be experiencing homelessness for the first time. In Measure 5.1, we see that 572 people who entered the system during the reporting period, 95 more than the previous year. 85 of them had records in the HMIS during the previous 24 months, which is 17 fewer than the previous year, leaving 487 first-time homeless in the system, or 112 fewer than the previous year. When we add permanent housing to that, in 5.2, we see an increase in the full universe. In total, when adding permanent housing to the system, we found that 879 people were presenting as first-time homeless, an increase of 215 people over the previous years. Measure 7, successful placement from street outreach and successful placement or retention in permanent housing. This can be summed up as positive outcomes. It measures how well the system is doing at stably housing people. The definition of success depends on the project type. In outreach, almost any exit that is not back to the street is successful, whereas in shelter, transitional, or rapid rehousing, only exit to permanent destinations count. In permanent supportive housing, retention in the program or an exit to a permanent destination count as successful. The expectation is that this data will be used to identify gaps in best practices and should be cited in the COC grant application in those conversations. In Measure 7.1 or 7A.1, we see that there were 0 exits from street outreach projects, so that table is simply zeroed out. But in 7B1, the changes in emergency shelter finally, we get to your data quality. The only element measured in the data quality report is the destination at discharge. This is one of the most difficult elements to collect, particularly at the shelter level, and yet one of the most vital for determining recidivism and positive outcomes. Each year, we strive to improve our percentage of missing data through monthly reporting and targeted outreach. In this slide, you can see how your community has been doing with that goal. There was no significant change in data quality for emergency shelter, though it did increase by 0.2 of a point. Transitional housing, however, achieved a significant increase in missing data, going from 0 to 10.5%. This looks worse than it is, though, as there were only 2 clients missing the data. So if those files can be updated, this table can still be saved. This is a perfect example of how a single record being neglected can have significant consequences for the entire community. Permanent supportive housing had a small decrease in missing data, down from 5.6 to 4.3%, and rapid rehousing showed only a very slight uptick from 0 missing to 0.36% missing. And there were no street outreach files to count for this measure. That ends the summary of your draft data for the System Performance Measures Report for fiscal year 2019. To recap, the last day we can accept comments on this draft data is Friday, February 14th, so that we have time to explore and correct any identified data issues for an anticipated submission date of Monday, February 24th, 2020. Please submit any questions or comments about this report to me or Kelsey. The HMIS and planning teams will continue reaching out to users and programs as we identify and try to correct or understand the data. Thank you, everyone. We expect to give a full report on the final data measures at some point in March.